Hello, and welcome back to Fosseway Classic Car Workshop. In this episode, I'm going to finish disassembling the remaining parts of the engine, ready to remove it. At the end of the last episode, I drained the oil because I need to take the oil canister off the side as it protrudes through the frame on this side of the engine. So that's where I'm going to start. There's a long bolt with a 5/8 socket that will take the canister off here. That runs all the way through and into the housing. Careful not to lose any remaining oil. Okay, then we see got a great big long filter in here that sits in the housing. With the oil canister out the way now, I need to take out the oil filter housing here. So you can see that on top there is where the sender unit comes out to send a signal for the oil pressure. Which is known for its unreliability actually, so that might be best to replace with a proper pipe to a proper gauge rather than an electrical signal. But this is the oil filter housing here, and you can see here the pickup pipe that comes from the oil pump itself. Important to note that I've actually got different length bolts going on. It's just the one on the right here that seems to be a different length by 1/8 of an inch. I'll disconnect where the feed pipe comes out of the sump. Okay, as I've done before, I've put the bolt straight back into the filter housing here, and I'm just going to put these cable ties around so that they stay in place. Right, let's let the oil drain out a little bit more. Next, I've got a simple disconnection for the rev counter. So this is what sends the signal to that for the engine speed. So that runs off the end of this camshaft here. Next, I've got the engine stabilizer bar at the back here. So that is mounted high, where the actual main engine mounts are mounted to the front of the engine quite low. So this kind of triangulates between the engine mounts at the bottom and controls the amount of rock on the engine. So you can see that if I push this, the engine actually does move a little bit because there are rubber bushes in there. Obviously, I need to disconnect that next. Then we've got the rubber mount with a metal collar in the middle and then the outer, so that the rubber can separate the engine movement from where it mounts onto the bulkhead. The torch shining down there, you can see that the second mount is located just down here, so that's the bolt head there. Access is quite restricted, and I've had to get to both sides of this bolt and nut in order to be able to undo it. So I'm going to kind of reach either side of the engine to get this undone. Okay, so there's the nut. When I'm going with my magnet, I should be able to pull the bolt through. There we go. So there's the bolt. Now I can lift up. So there's the stabilizer bar itself. And there's the bottom plate. You can see it's just a small bush in the bottom here. So let's put all this together again so it doesn't get lost. So with this stabilizer bar out of the way, you can see there's a little bit more movement, particularly on the back of the engine, because obviously we've got the engine mounts at the front here. The other main element in supporting the engine gearbox is the gearbox mount. So underneath there is a big bracket and a spring and a locating pin, and that's what holds the gearbox in position. Another thing I haven't disconnected yet is the starter motor, so that's it there with a red cap on it. So there are electrical connections that go on, so this great big chunky cable here comes from the battery, and then we've got a smaller one which comes from the ignition switch to actually fire it up. Now that one already looks like it's disconnected itself, so that's the one with the yellow connector there. So I just need to get onto this terminal here. Make sure that that's stowed out of the way. Another couple of things I could do with taking off the front of the engine here. So there's this tensioner for the fan belt, and then this crank pulley as well to make the engine shorter and to give me more chance of getting past the frame here. First I need to knock these locking tab washers out of the way so I can actually get to the head of the bolts and undo them. lots of movement there. There we go. Right, now this old tensioner pulley. It's a 9/16 socket. There's one here and there's another one hidden out the way just behind, underneath the spring here. So this is the easier one to get out. So I've got a shorter bolt here, a longer one that goes in from this part. To get this big nut off the harmonic damper on the end of the crankshaft here, I need to get a large socket with this extension on there. But basically, if I turn it by hand, that's going to just turn the engine. So I've connected up this air impact wrench or impact driver, and that should be able to do it. That's tightened. There we go. There I have it. I'm going to use this and lever against this bolt head here, because I don't really want to go against the aluminium casing, because that won't do it any good at all. Now I've just got this pointer to take off as well. It's that tight when you get over the frame here, so even those two set screws there holding the pointer for the crankshaft timing need to come off as well. My next task is to get this centre console out of the way, because of course I've got the gear stick there and I've got the prop shaft that runs through the tunnel there to disconnect as well. So obviously I need to get the gearbox out with the engine, which means the prop needs to come out and the gear stick needs to be disconnected as well. So with a 1/2 inch socket, I'm taking out these dome nuts that we've got here. So those are obviously just for show because they're in the cabin, but they're exactly the same ones that are used in the engine bay on the engine. So I'm going to remove the gear knob here, and this one here is actually really quite cracked, so it probably needs replacing. But you can actually feel there's an awful lot of weight in it, and that's for good reason, because it's actually part of the mechanism here to give a good throw and thrust of the linkage. It's deliberately quite heavy, so that's a kind of good solid piece of, I assume, steel in there that then been overmoulded with plastic, and then the 1, 2, 3, 4, which I can just about make out in reverse in there. Right, so that's the aerial connection that's undone itself, and then we've got the fuse here for the radio, so disconnect that. There's the fuse. Taking out the other seat belt on the other side before, but now the sensor console feels much looser. I should be able to lift it out. This is what I've been wanting to get at, which is this cover that sits on top of the gearbox. So I need to lift this cover off, which will then get me access to where the prop shaft connects to the gearbox. So this is where there's a big bung that seals off the transmission tunnel from the cockpit, and it looks as though we've got a bit of a split in the actual steel part of the body, and a bit of rust. But this all just needs a good clean up, because I'm not actually sure what's there and what's not. Let's get that out of the way. It actually looks like the splits happen because of the proximity of part of the gearbox here, so I need to look into that, because that doesn't look quite right at the moment. It may be to do with the fact that the engine, as I pointed out in the previous episode, is slightly too far to this side, as is the axis of the engine is a bit too far over, so it's leaning over and it's rotated this way, so it might well have been pushing the gearbox against the transmission tunnel here. So let's take this gaiter off. Now to take this gearbox cover off. Covered in oil. Again, part of the reason for doing all of this is this kind of discovery and trying to rectify it. Here we've got a breather that goes up to the engine bay. This here is the cable that goes to give your vehicle speed, so that goes directly through to here. So that wire goes all the way around, purely mechanical system, and this should be a very pleasurable experience by the time this car's done. Slotting it first, second, third, fourth gear. Nice. Just take a quick moment to collect up the fixings. They look awful, of course. They could actually be cleaned up and reused, so it's absolutely worth keeping them for reference, if nothing else. Of course, the reason for taking all of this off is to get access to this. So this is where the prop shaft connects to the rear wheels. Of course, you don't realise it when you're in the car, but you've got that spinning prop literally a few centimetres away from your left arm. So let's get to work disconnecting that. Before I disconnect the prop, I've just given the footwell here a bit of a careful check over for fixings that I might have missed, and then vacuumed it out because the mess was beginning to annoy me. And I've started picking away basically the remnants of the carpet that's glued to this transmission tunnel, and actually it doesn't look too bad. There's kind of all sorts of still wet sealant, I think that is, or dum-dum that's in there, as well as various bits of carpet that are just kind of matted with glue. And actually when you peel it away, there is a decent steel panel still behind there. So that's encouraging, but I'm still a little bit concerned about this bit here where the steel has split because of pressure from the gearbox, so I need to investigate that further. So with the gearbox cover removed, I can now disconnect the prop. It's just 4 bolts that go through here that join the 2 flanges together, both 9/16. The gearbox in neutral, of course, and then the other end of the prop is loose because that's been disconnected from the rear axle, of course, before. Rotate it round and forward again. Two. Three. Before I separate these 2 flanges, I need to make sure that I mark where they align. So I'm just going to use the centre punch here to mark them, because you can get prop out of balance issues if it's not properly aligned. So just those little indentations there with the centre punch will be sufficient to make sure that they align the correct way when I come to reassemble it. Now carefully pry this away. There we go. Prop shaft is now free. So with the prop disconnected, there are 4 things to take off. One is the gear lever, because of course the gearbox isn't going to go through that hole with this lever still attached. Then there's the breather for the gearbox here. There are these 2 connectors for these cables that go for the reverse light switch. And then there's this cable which goes to the speedometer. So this is an 11/16 socket for the gear lever. The speedo cable disconnects with a 5/8 spanner. It's this cable that spins around, and it's square drive from the gearbox here. Now for the leads for reverse lamps. So the one on the right here is brown and green. The one on the left here is just plain green. That's simple enough. And then there's the breather, so that's already disconnected from the engine. Oh, that was obviously a very good seal. So I'll pull that through from the other side as well. I'm now lying underneath the car because I've got the final few disconnections to make. So I've got the clutch slave cylinder here, so that needs disconnecting from the lever here. So there's a circlip that needs taking off, and I need to take off the spring as well. Then I've got this big plate here, which is the reaction plate for the front torsion springs that run down that way. So that needs to come off because of course the bell housing here needs to get past that way, and of course it's not going to with that great big plate in the way. And I've got this under shield as well, which needs moving out of the way because the back of the gearbox is going to have to drop right down in order to get the angle at the front of the engine to go up. So I need this to be out of the way too. Right, now to take the actual clutch slave cylinder off the gearbox bell housing. So you've got 9/16 offset ring spanner here. There we go, so that's the stud come out. I can bend this pipe out of the way. Okay, now for the reaction plate here. So this here is the great big front spring torsion bar. This is the torsion reaction plate here, and I need to undo this and lift the whole lot out of the way so that I can get the bell housing here past and through and out at the front. So I've taken this bolt out here that goes into this longitudinal, and I now need to undo this one here. As you can see, access isn't that great, but if I do it a part of a turn at the time, I can get this spanner in here. Unfortunately, it is turning. Okay, with that disengaged, I'm now able to drift this rearwards and hopefully out of the way. Getting this torsion spring reactor plate out has been really tricky. So just getting the two bolts, small bolts that go through here out has been pretty difficult. I've probably made it a bit more complicated than it is, but when you get to the point where you can hammer this rearwards in the car and get it away from the bolts that are still held in place by the lever that's on the torsion spring, it's a lot easier. So I'm glad to have this out. Now I can connect up the engine crane onto the cylinder head studs here, and all that's left is the two engine mounts at the front and then the gearbox mount at the rear, and I should be able to start lifting it out. So I'm using a 3/4 inch socket to take out the dome-headed nuts. So I'm going to use these brackets that are on this engine lifting beam. This is going to help me adjust the angle of the engine and gearbox as it comes out, which will make it a lot easier. So I've taken the standard lifting pieces off the engine. I'm hoping this will give me more control, because obviously I need to get the engine over and above the frame at the front here. All that's left holding the engine and gearbox onto the car are the two engine mounts there. You can see the rubber donut just there. So there's one of these each side. And at the back there's the gearbox mount, so I'll climb under here. So there's a pin in the middle of the gearbox just there, and that's got a spring around it, and so that sits on that bracket. So if I take that bracket out, basically the back of the gearbox will drop out. So I'm going to put my trolley jack underneath the gearbox here to support that, undo this bracket, and then I'll be able to drop the back of the gearbox out in a controlled way. That's the back of the gearbox undone. Right, it's now time to undo these engine mounts. Take the bolts out. I've already loosened them, so it shouldn't be too difficult. In fact, that one's ready to take up by hand. So I can now get the engine crane to take the strain and lift the engine out. There it goes, right. We're off. So with the help of my son, who's with me now, we're going to start lifting this out. I'm going to start by lowering the tail of the gearbox very carefully. Lift it up and forwards a little bit. Okay, yeah, it is there. And then we need to start basically shifting the whole lot this way.
So is it not connected at all? Anywhere?
No. Well, at least I hope not.
Just touchdown, yeah. That should be fine.
That's fine. So yeah, feel free to let go. Good job.
So we've taken the engine out. Job.
It's really good to finally get the engine out of the car and I can get it off to Roger for its restoration. I've got a load of bits here that need refurbishing as well. So before I get any further into taking bits out of this engine bay, I need to sort all of those parts out. Well, thanks for the sunlight for helping me, and thank you to you for watching. See you next time.